They mocked a veteran for inheriting nothing but a broken watermill. No land, no fortune, just ruins, and his loyal dog, Buddy. But what if the place everyone laughed at was hiding a secret worth millions? One autumn evening, under the fading golden light, Buddy suddenly froze at the mossy stones. His ears pricked, his amber eyes fixed, his body tense. What he uncovered next would change everything. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments and hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The late summer sky lay heavy with warmth, the air thick with the mingled scent of pine and fading grass, and already a tinge of gold clung to the trees as if autumn were leaning in early. The road was dusty, sun dappled through branches, and the sound of cicadas hummed like a restless memory that would not fade. David Miller shifted the strap of his worn canvas duffel bag higher on his shoulder, the weight not much compared to the rucksack he had carried in war, but enough to remind him of the years. At 47, his broad frame still looked powerful, yet the stiffness in his gait betrayed old wounds. His hair was chestnut, streaked heavily with silver near the temples, tousled by the wind. A thin, silver-streaked beard lined his jaw, giving him a rugged, tired edge. He was burly, his shoulders wide, his hands scarred from both battle and years of labor. Yet his dark eyes carried a depth of fatigue not from the body, but from the soul. Those eyes were restless, caught between pride and shame, haunted by things he had seen and done. At his side patted Buddy, the German shepherd, 6 years old, with a sable coat that gleamed in the sunlight and a black saddle running across his back. His amber eyes glowed sharp and intelligent, and his gait was strong, confident, and purposeful. Buddy's ears were pricked, constantly alert, as though guarding not only his master but also every secret of the land around them. For David, Buddy was more than a dog. He was a partner, a silent listener, a tether to sanity during nights when sleep brought nightmares. Buddy had been trained, disciplined, but in retirement, he had taken to his role as a loyal companion, fiercely protective yet gentle in the way he nuzzled David's rough palm whenever despair threatened. David paused at the crest of a small hill, staring down at what should have been a homecoming gift, the watermill. The old wooden structure leaned toward the stream like a weary man bent by time. The wheel, once proud, was covered in moss, its turning slowed to nothing but the dripping memory of rain. Ivy crawled up the sides of the faded boards, and the roof sagged under the weight of neglect. The land around it was choked with weeds, yet the late sunlight bathed the place in a strange glow, as though it resisted decay by sheer stubbornness. His relatives had gathered weeks ago when the inheritance was read. They were younger, sharper, quick to claim the fertile fields and thriving farms Theodore had left behind. David, absent for much of his adult life, had been offered little choice. He had no house of his own, no legal standing to argue for more, no family to back him up. The others took what was valuable, and all that remained was this watermill that nobody wanted. "You should sell it for scrap," his cousin Mark had said, his clean-shaven face smooth, his hands uncalloused by labor. "You've got nothing, David. Don't drag yourself down with rot." The words still rang in David's mind, cutting deeper than they should. Buddy barked once, sharp and clear, pulling David back from the memory. The dog bounded ahead toward the stream, nose to the ground, tail high. David followed slowly, his boots raising dust. His faded jeans clung uncomfortably to his legs, the beige shirt sticking to his back with sweat. He looked every bit the weary laborer, though inside he was still trying to reconcile soldier and civilian. When he reached the edge of the mill, he placed a hand on the weathered wood. The texture was rough, splinters pressing against his calloused fingers. A strange wave of both defeat and defiance surged in him. This was not a farm, not a fortune, not a new beginning, but it was something, and for a man who had returned with little more than shadows, something was better than nothing. In the small town nearby, the people knew of him. Some remembered the tall, broad-shouldered boy who had left decades ago, head held high. Others only saw the veteran who returned older, poorer, dragging a dog at his side. Sarah, his late cousin's widow, tall and slender with auburn hair streaked faintly with gray, had been among the few who spoke kindly. She had soft green eyes but a rigid posture, as though life had forced her to carry burdens she never asked for. "You're stronger than they know," she had told him quietly, handing him a loaf of bread after the will was settled. "Don't let their laughter decide your worth. David remembered the words, though at the time he could only nod, ashamed to accept charity. Standing at the mill now, David heard the echo of that kindness in his head. He set down his duffel bag and drew a long breath. "This is what we have, Buddy," he muttered. Buddy tilted his head, ears twitching, as if he understood. The dog stepped closer, pressing his warm body against David's leg. That silent reassurance meant more than any words his relatives had spoken. Inside, the mill was worse than outside. Dust choked the air, beams sagged, the smell of mildew rising from the damp floor. But David's eyes caught fragments of what it once had been: sturdy craftsmanship, precise gears, and the quiet dignity of a place that had served generations. He imagined his great-uncle Theodore, the man who had kept it running long after others would have abandoned it. Theodore had been eccentric, people said too stubborn to leave, too proud to sell. David had not been there when the man died, and guilt gnawed at him. Perhaps this inheritance was less a gift and more a punishment, a reminder of all the years he had been absent. He dropped his bag in the corner, sat heavily on a broken chair, and rubbed his face with both hands. The silence pressed close, broken only by the soft panting of Buddy exploring the shadows. Doubt slithered into his mind. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe he should walk away, sell the wood for scraps, rent a room in town, disappear into obscurity. But then he looked at Buddy, who had stopped at a patch of sunlight breaking through the slats, tail wagging slow and steady. In the dog's amber eyes, he saw not mockery, not doubt, but expectation, as if Buddy knew this place was not the end, but the beginning. David leaned back, exhaling, his chest heavy, but his resolve stirring faintly. He could not abandon this yet. He owed it to himself, to Theodore, perhaps even to the memory of strangers he could not yet name. The mill was broken, yes, but so was he. And maybe, just maybe, in fixing one, he could begin to mend the other. The morning after David set down his duffel bag in the broken mill, he rose with the first beams of sunlight filtering through the gaps in the roof. The air was damp with dew, the stream outside whispering against the mossy stones, and Buddy already paced near the door, tail wagging, nose twitching. David rubbed his stiff shoulders, aware of the ache in his back from sleeping on warped planks. He stepped outside, greeted by a hush broken only by the distant chatter of crows. The town, a half-hour walk from the mill, was small, with narrow streets lined by wooden houses whose paint had faded in places, each porch decorated with flower pots or old rocking chairs. People here had long memories, and when David appeared at the edge of Main Street, his broad frame unmistakable, conversations slowed. Some nodded, others stared. Buddy trotted faithfully at his side, his sable coat catching the light, amber eyes alert. Mark's words from days before echoed in his mind, mocking and sharp. "It's rot, David. Sell it." Yet here in town, the ridicule did not come from relatives alone. A group of men stood outside the hardware store, sipping coffee from paper cups. They were farmers, with sunburned faces and strong arms. One of them, Thomas Ray, tall with a barrel chest, grizzled beard, and a booming laugh, nudged his companion when David passed. "There goes the soldier with his useless mill," he said loudly. Thomas had once lost land in a bad deal, and bitterness seemed to have hardened him. The men chuckled, and though they meant little harm, their laughter carried the sting of dismissal. David kept his head down, jaw tightening. Buddy stiffened, hackles raised, but David murmured, "Easy, boy," and the dog settled, though his eyes stayed locked on the men. As David continued along the street, he entered the small general store. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Green, a widow in her late 70s, with silver hair tied neatly into a bun, thin spectacles perched on her nose. Her frame was slight, her hands veined and tremulous, yet her eyes remained bright. She remembered Theodore and had often supplied him with flour and nails. When she saw David, she did not laugh. Instead, she reached beneath the counter and produced a small loaf of bread wrapped in wax paper. "On the house," she said with a gentle smile. "Theodore would have wanted you fed. Don't let them tell you the mill means nothing." David hesitated, shame pressing heavy, but the warmth in her expression disarmed him. He accepted, murmuring his thanks. On the way back, by the well in the center of town, a little boy named Jacob ran up to Buddy. Jacob was 8, freckle-faced, with sandy blonde hair that stuck out in every direction, wearing patched trousers and boots too big for him. He carried a tin bowl filled with water, which he carefully placed before Buddy. The dog sniffed, lapped gratefully, and Jacob laughed. "He's a good one, mister. Best dog I've ever seen." David looked down at the boy, surprised by the unguarded kindness. Jacob's mother, Clara, stood nearby. She was a young woman, mid-20s, her brown hair tied back loosely, her dress faded, but clean. She had the tired grace of someone raising a child alone. She gave David a small nod, not daring more under the stares of neighbors, but her eyes conveyed silent respect. David felt the conflicting waves more sharply than ever. The ridicule of the men, the compassion of Mrs. Green, the simple offering of a child. Inside, he wrestled with bitterness. Part of him wanted to storm back at Thomas Ray, to shout that the war had taken years from him, that he had not chosen the mill, that life had not been fair. But another part softened at the taste of fresh bread, at Buddy's wagging tail as he drank, at the boy's laughter. Maybe not everyone wished him failure. Maybe there were threads of goodwill he could still grasp. Back at the mill, David tore a piece of the bread, chewing, slowly, as Buddy lay nearby. The warmth of the loaf contrasted with the damp chill of the mill, reminding him of meals shared with soldiers in muddy fields, where even the smallest kindness had felt like salvation. He stared at the sagging beams above, imagining what the mill could become. The laughter of the town echoed in his ears, but so did Mrs. Green's words, "Don't let them tell you the mill means nothing." And in that moment, hope stirred faintly, fragile but alive. The mill creaked through the night like an old man whispering to himself. By dawn, mist curled low over the stream, dampening the moss on the wheel and softening the sharp edges of the broken timbers. David woke on the makeshift bedding he had laid out, his back sore but his mind restless. Buddy stretched beside him, yawning wide, his sable coat catching faint streaks of pale light that slipped between the warped boards. The dog rose, ears twitching, and padded toward a wooden chest half buried under dust in the corner. David followed with slow curiosity, his boots stirring old shavings and cobwebs. The chest was heavy, oak reinforced with rusted iron bands, its lid swollen with moisture. Kneeling, David brushed away layers of grime, his rough hands trembling more from anticipation than fatigue. With effort, he forced the latch open. Inside lay bundles of brittle papers, a fountain pen long, dry, and at the bottom, wrapped in waxed cloth, a notebook bound in cracked leather. Theodore's scrawled initials, T.H., were barely visible on the cover. David sat on a stool near the faint light and opened the notebook carefully. The handwriting was uneven, the ink faded, but still legible. "This mill," the first entry read, "is more than wood and stone. It must remain more than a machine for flour. It has been, and must always be, a refuge." As he turned the pages, his heart beat faster. Names were written, sometimes with dates, often followed by cryptic notes. "Family of 4, arrived in rain, hungry but hopeful," or "German boy, eyes fearful, asked only for water." These were not customers, they were people hiding, people running. The words described Samuel, David's great-grandfather, taking in strangers during the chaos of a world war, sheltering them behind false walls, providing food when he himself had little. The most striking line read, "This mill does not only grind wheat, it grinds despair into hope. It must stand, even when all else falls." Buddy sat at David's feet, tilting his head, amber eyes fixed on his master's face as if sensing the gravity of the discovery. David's throat tightened. He remembered the scornful laughter in town, Mark's dismissive sneer, Thomas Ray's booming jokes. They saw rot. But this notebook revealed something else. The mill had been a sanctuary, its timbers steeped in courage and kindness. For the first time, David felt the weight of inheritance shift from burden to responsibility. That afternoon, Sarah arrived. She walked slowly up the path, tall and slender, auburn hair tied back, her thin frame wrapped in a faded green cardigan despite the warmth. Her skin was pale, freckled at the nose, and her steps carried both grace and weariness. Widowhood had carved patience into her face, but her green eyes still flickered with resilience. She carried a basket covered with cloth. "Bread and apples," she said, voice soft but firm. "You look like you could use both," Buddy barked once, cautious, then relaxed when David nodded. Sarah crouched slightly to let the dog sniff her hand, unafraid of his size. David hesitated before showing her the notebook. "This belonged to Theodore," he explained. Sarah sat on the edge of a beam, fingers tracing the cracked leather reverently. She had known Theodore as a stern but fair man. He used to come into town with his wagon, she recalled, her eyes distant. People thought he was odd, keeping to himself, but he gave quietly flour to the church, firewood to widows. Now I see. He gave more than anyone knew. Later, as the sun dipped low, David heard footsteps near the gate. It was Reverend Collins, the town's minister. He was in his early 60s, with a lean frame and a kindly face framed by thinning white hair. His clean-shaven jaw carried lines of both laughter and sorrow, and his gray eyes radiated gentleness. He had lost a son in Iraq, a grief that softened rather than hardened him. "I heard you were back," he said warmly, "and that you've been given the mill." He chuckled lightly, though not cruelly. "It isn't much, is it?" His gaze then landed on the notebook David held, and he grew serious. "Ah," Theodore's hand. The Reverend sat, and his voice dropped. "He told me once, long ago, that the mill remembers. I thought it was poetry. Seems it was truth." They spoke until dusk, Sarah listening quietly. Buddy stretched between them. David read passages aloud, his voice catching on words about frightened families, children who had laughed in the dark while Samuel kept watch. The Reverend clasped his hands, whispering, "This is history, David. You must not let it be lost." For a moment, David felt anchored, not drifting. These pages tied him to something greater than ridicule. When the Reverend left and Sarah returned to town, David sat again in the fading light, notebook open on his knees. Buddy rested his head against David's boot, warm and steady. The laughter of the town still lingered, but softer now, dulled by the echo of Theodore's words. The mill does not only grind wheat, it grinds despair into hope. And in that dim silence, David began to believe the mill was not only his to own, but his to honor. The days grew shorter as summer leaned fully toward autumn. The air around the mill carried a new crispness, tinged with the scent of damp leaves and smoke from nearby chimneys. David rose early, driven by a mixture of restlessness and duty. He had spent nights poring over Theodore's notebook, rereading the words about Samuel's courage, imagining the frightened families who had once hidden in the dark corners of this same mill. Each page stirred both pride and a gnawing question. What exactly had been left behind? Buddy, ever watchful, had grown more intent, as if sensing his master's thoughts. The German shepherd would circle the yard, nose low to the ground, tail rigid, occasionally barking into the empty forest as though announcing vigilance. His sable coat shone against the early light, and his amber eyes seemed to glow with purpose. That morning, Buddy led David into the mill's basement, where old grinding stones lay scattered. The floor was cracked, the air musty, shafts of golden light piercing through gaps in the planks above. David trailed behind, wiping sweat from his brow, his faded jeans streaked with dust. He saw Buddy pawing frantically at a corner where the largest millstone leaned against the wall. Moss covered the stone in streaks of green, and the dog's nails scraped urgently, as though he were certain something was hidden beneath. David crouched, pressed his hand against the cool surface, and felt the stone shift slightly. He fetched a crowbar from a rusted toolbox. With effort, he pried at the edge, the stone groaning until it rolled enough to reveal a hollow cavity beneath. Inside lay a metal box, tarnished but intact. His heart pounded as he pulled it free. The box creaked open under his rough hands. Inside was a folded sheet of parchment, yellowed and brittle. He unfolded it carefully and found a map hand-drawn with precise lines. It marked the area around the mill, the stream, and the forest beyond, with a bold X etched near an oak tree by the creek. Alongside the map was a letter in faded ink. "If you find this, you must remember the mill's legacy is not one man's fortune. It is the promise we made to strangers, the duty to community. Keep the trust, share what was given." David stared at the words, feeling the weight of them settle on his shoulders. This was not about inheritance, not about proving himself to Mark or the farmers who laughed. It was about stewardship. Later that day, Sarah arrived again. She carried a scarf around her shoulders, the auburn of her hair catching the sunlight, and her green eyes narrowed with concern. "You look pale," she said, noticing the sweat on his brow. David showed her the map and letter. Sarah read silently, her slender fingers trembling slightly as she traced the ink. "This changes everything," she whispered. "Do you see, David? Theodore wanted you to find this. She looked at him, her freckled face softened by emotion. This isn't about them laughing at you. It's about us remembering. In the afternoon, Reverend Collins returned with a companion, Margaret Thornton, a local historian in her 50s. She was a tall woman, her gray hair cut neatly to her shoulders, her sharp blue eyes peering through round spectacles. She wore a long brown coat and carried a leather satchel filled with papers. Margaret had a reputation for sternness, but was respected for her knowledge of county records. She listened intently as David explained the discovery. Adjusting her glasses, she examined the letter and map, her lips pressed tight. "Authentic," she finally murmured. "This is Samuel's hand, no doubt. He served more than flour here. He served lives." Her voice carried both reverence and excitement. Buddy sat by the hearth, head high, tail wagging slowly, as if proud of his role in the revelation. Margaret leaned down to scratch behind his ears, her demeanor softening. "This dog may have just reopened a chapter of history," she said with a faint smile. For a woman known for formality, the praise carried weight. As dusk fell, David stood outside with Sarah, watching the leaves turn gold under the slanting light. The stream murmured, carrying fragments of memory. "They all thought it was worthless," David said, his deep voice raw. "But maybe it was just waiting." Sarah touched his arm lightly, her hand warm through his sleeve. "Not waiting," she corrected softly. "Trusting." He looked down at Buddy, who sat between them, alert to the sounds of the forest. In that quiet moment, David felt both humbled and strengthened. The discovery was not his triumph alone. It was a call to honor those who had trusted the mill long before he was born. Inside, the letter lay open on the table, its ink fading but its message clear. The treasure was not merely wealth, it was a covenant. David knew now that whatever lay ahead by the creek would not belong to him alone, but to every soul who still believed in mercy, in memory, in hope. The morning sun broke through a haze of drifting clouds, casting pale shafts of light on the watermill. Its wheel groaned faintly, as if remembering better days, the moss dripping from each paddle. David stood on the bank, sleeves rolled up, fatigue pressing heavy on his shoulders. Theodore's notebook and the hidden map lay secure in the mill, yet new burdens pressed in. A letter from the county office had arrived the evening before. The property was to be inspected, and unless immediate improvements were made, the mill would be declared unsafe, barred from use. The following day, the inspector came. His name was Gerald Watson, a man in his late 50s with a square jaw, thick mustache, and a heavy-set build that strained the seams of his navy jacket. His gray hair was slicked back, his steel blue eyes unyielding, and his voice clipped with the tone of one who had delivered bad news many times. He walked with a slight limp, the result of a workplace accident years earlier, and it had soured his patience. With a clipboard in hand, Gerald circled the mill, frowning at every crack, every sagging beam. "It's a hazard," he pronounced, his voice carrying down to the stream. "Roof unstable, foundation weak. Mr. Miller, unless repairs are done within 30 days, this place is condemned." David clenched his jaw, a surge of frustration tightening his chest. He had expected challenges, but the finality in Gerald's voice struck like a hammer. Buddy barked once, sharp, as though echoing his master's discontent. David tried to argue, spoke of history, of Theodore's legacy, but Gerald only shook his head. "History doesn't keep people safe, structure does." He left with a final note on his clipboard, his limp evident as he crossed the uneven path. That night, David sat at the mill's table, his rough hands covering his face. The map and letter lay open before him, but hope felt fragile. Sarah visited, her tall figure framed in the doorway, auburn, hair glinting in lantern light. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her slender frame radiating quiet strength. "You can't give up," she urged softly. Her pale face, lined by worry, was resolute. "Others may not see what this place means, but I do, and you're not alone." Her words lingered after she left, yet doubt gnawed. The next morning, help arrived in an unexpected form. Henry Dawson, the village blacksmith, walked up the path carrying a bundle of tools. He was a broad man in his 60s, with arms like iron from years at the forge. His face was weathered, darkened by soot, with a thick white beard that framed a mouth quick to scowl but quicker to smile when softened. His eyes, though, were kind, deep brown and steady. Years earlier, he had lost his eldest son in an accident at the forge, and since then, He had carried both grief and wisdom, pouring himself into work and into helping neighbors quietly. "Heard about the inspector," Henry said in a gravelly voice. "Can't stand to see a man robbed of what's his. Here." He handed David a hammer, nails, and a crowbar. "They're spares but strong. Use them." He gave Buddy a hearty pat on the head, the dog's tail thumping. Later that week, another ally came forward. Mrs. Chen, a widow in her 80s, once a refugee who had settled in the town decades ago. She was small and wiry, her back slightly bent, her black hair streaked with white, her almond eyes sharp despite age. Her wrinkled face carried stories of hardship but also resilience. She walked slowly with a cane, wrapped in a plain shawl, but her presence commanded quiet respect. She sat with David by the stream and spoke of her youth. "Samuel," she said, her accented voice trembling, "he gave my family food when we had none. We were strangers, frightened. He asked nothing in return." Her gaze moved to the mill, her eyes glistening. "This place sheltered more than grain. Don't let them erase it." Her words pierced David's heart. He thought of the laughter of Thomas Ray and the disapproval of Gerald Watson, but against them were these moments of kindness. Henry's tools, Sarah's encouragement, Mrs. Chen's memory. Buddy pressed against his leg, steady as always, amber eyes locked on him, as if to say, "Stand firm." Days passed in a rhythm of labor. David patched beams with Henry's tools, sweat dripping down his face, his beige shirt clinging to his back. Sarah occasionally brought food, her tall form moving quietly through the mill as she swept corners or steadied ladders. Mrs. Chen came often to tell more stories, of how Samuel had opened the door to families fleeing violence, how she had once hidden in the loft with her younger sister, listening to the wheel turn like a lullaby. Each tale tied David more firmly to his duty. At night, he would sit by lantern light, Theodore's notebook open, Buddy lying at his feet, his sable coat warm against David's boots. He no longer saw the mill as merely broken timbers. It was wounded, like him. But wounds could heal if given care, and with each nail driven, each beam secured, he felt his own scars ease slightly. The inspector's deadline loomed, yet for the first time, David believed he might not face it alone. The forest that stretched beyond the mill had begun its autumn transformation, a canvas of gold and amber painted by the slow retreat of summer. The creek whispered through the undergrowth, its water cold and clear, reflecting the shifting leaves above. David carried the map folded in his pocket, the letter's words still etched in his mind. Beside him, Buddy bounded ahead, powerful muscles rippling under his sable coat, ears pricked toward every rustle of the woods. The dog's amber eyes were bright with intent, as though he too understood the significance of the day. David followed the path marked on the map, boots crunching against damp leaves. His beige shirt clung to his back with sweat, though the air was cool. The ground sloped gently downward until they reached the creek's bend, where a giant oak tree towered with roots sprawling like veins over the soil. Its bark was thick, weathered by time, and in the fading light, it seemed a sentinel guarding something sacred. Buddy barked once, tail stiff, then began digging furiously at the base where the roots knotted. Dirt flew behind him, paws working with practiced urgency. David dropped to his knees, scooping soil with his hands. His nails split, his knuckles scraped, but determination burned within. The hollow between the roots slowly deepened until the iron edge of something metallic scraped against his fingertips. Together, man and dog uncovered a large chest, its iron frame rusted but intact, its wooden sides darkened by decades underground. With a grunt, David pulled it free, his arms straining against its weight. He rested it on the ground, his breath ragged, Buddy panting at his side. The chest opened with a screech of protest. Inside, wrapped in cloth yellowed with age, were stacks of silver coins, delicate necklaces, and a scattering of small gold ingots. Beneath them lay letters, folded and tied with ribbon now frayed to threads. David lifted the letters first, his rough hands trembling. The words were written in varied scripts, some elegant, others hurried. They told of families fleeing across oceans, of children hidden in wagons, of nights when hunger and fear pressed harder than the cold. Again and again, the writers spoke of gratitude. "America gave us safety," one letter read. "Samuel kept our treasures, but also our dignity. Whoever finds this, keep the trust." David's throat closed, tears pricking his eyes. He sat back on his heels, clutching the letters. Buddy rested his head against David's knee, warm and steady. The coins and gold shimmered faintly in the slanting sun, but to David they paled against the weight of those words. This was not wealth to be hoarded. It was a trust passed through generations. He could almost feel Samuel's presence in the forest air, hear Theodore's voice in the rustling leaves. Later that afternoon, Sarah found him there. She had walked from town, her tall, slender form visible between the trees, auburn hair tied in a loose braid, her green eyes catching the dying light. She gasped softly when she saw the chest open. "David, is it real?" Her pale, freckled face flushed with awe as she knelt to touch one of the ribbons. He handed her a letter, and she read silently. When she looked back at him, her eyes shone with tears. "They trusted your family with this, and now it's you." Margaret Thornton, the historian, arrived soon after, drawn by David's request earlier that week. She moved quickly despite her age, her long brown coat brushing the ground, spectacles slipping down her sharp nose. When she peered into the chest, her blue eyes widened. She lifted a coin, then a letter, her hands surprisingly gentle. "This is extraordinary," she murmured. "Not just valuables, evidence of lives, of courage. It's a time capsule." Her voice trembled with reverence, and for once the sternness left her features. Word spread quicker than David expected. That evening, Henry Dawson, the blacksmith, trudged up to the mill, broad shoulders stooped from the day's work, his beard dusted with ash. He studied the chest, his deep brown eyes reflecting the firelight. "Treasure, some will call it," he said gravely, "but treasure doesn't always buy honor. Be careful, lad. Some folks will come sniffing when they hear." He handed David a sturdy lock forged in his shop. "Use this, protect it, not for you, for them. Mrs. Chen also came, leaning on her cane, her wiry frame bent but her almond eyes sharp as ever. She sat by the chest, her thin hands shaking as she touched a letter. She whispered in her accented voice, "This one, it speaks of a family from my village. They must have passed through here." A tear traced down her wrinkled cheek. She smiled faintly. "Samuel was right to hide it, and you are right to keep it safe." The night fell quiet, the forest dark around them. David secured the chest, Henry's lock clicking shut. He placed the letters carefully back inside, the coins glinting under lantern light. Standing, he looked around at the faces gathered, Sarah's tall figure glowing with empathy, Margaret's sharp eyes burning with knowledge, Henry's broad frame solid with loyalty, Mrs. Chen's frail body carrying the strength of memory. Buddy sat beside him, ears high, amber eyes gleaming with pride. In that moment, David understood the truth fully. This chest was not his inheritance. It was his responsibility. The silver and gold carried weight, yes, but the true treasure lay in the words of gratitude, in the trust of strangers long gone, in the memory of a community that had once stood together against fear. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and whispered, "I won't fail you." Buddy barked once, sharp and sure, as though sealing the vow. News of the discovery spread through the town faster than David had imagined. The whispers began at the general store, carried by Thomas Ray's booming voice, and by dusk, every porch seemed to know the mill had yielded treasure. By the week's end, his relatives arrived, not with warm greetings but with accusations. Mark was first, striding up the path in a pressed shirt and slacks, his dark hair slicked back, his angular face flushed with self-righteous indignation. His clean-shaven jaw tightened as he spoke, his tone sharp. "You think you can keep it all, David? That chest belongs to the family. You've no right to hoard it." His sister, Elaine, trailed behind him. She was in her 40s, thin with sharp cheekbones and narrow eyes, her blonde hair tied tightly in a bun that seemed to pull her entire face into a permanent expression of disdain. She had married into money, but had never stopped coveting more. Her voice was shrill as she added, "You disappeared for decades. We stayed here, built lives here, cared for Theodore when you were gone, and now you claim the fortune?" David stood before the mill, arms crossed, his burly frame firm, though his chest churned. Buddy growled low, the sable hairs on his back rising, amber eyes locked on Mark's every gesture. "It isn't fortune," David said evenly, though his voice carried a quiet thunder. "It's trust. It belongs not to us alone, but to every name in those letters." Mark laughed derisively, waving a dismissive hand. "Letters? Sentimental scraps don't hold value in court. Gold does. Property does. When the dispute escalated, the courthouse in town convened a hearing. The building itself was a modest brick structure, its white columns weathered but dignified, standing at the end of Main Street. Inside, the benches were filled with townsfolk, eager for spectacle. Sarah sat among them, her tall frame erect, auburn braid falling over her shoulder, green eyes flashing with both worry and resolve. Henry Dawson leaned forward on the bench, arms folded across his chest, his thick beard hiding a grim frown. Mrs. Chen sat near the front, her small frame wrapped in a shawl, her cane resting beside her, her almond eyes alert and determined. Margaret Thornton, spectacles perched on her nose, held a folder of documents like a weapon ready to be wielded. At the bench sat Judge Whitaker, a man in his 60s with a stern face softened by deep lines of thought. His full head of silver hair gave him a distinguished air, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing. He had a reputation for fairness, though some whispered he was hard to sway without evidence. His clean-shaven jaw and upright posture spoke of discipline. Once a lawyer who lost his only son to illness, he valued truth as both burden and balm. Mark and Elaine spoke first, their voices cutting through the room. Elaine painted David as irresponsible, a wanderer returning only to claim wealth. Mark brandished photographs of the chest and coins, insisting they be divided among heirs. David remained silent, fists clenched, until the judge turned his gaze upon him. Slowly, David rose, his beige shirt neatly tucked despite wear, his silver-streaked hair catching the light from the tall windows. His voice was steady. "Your Honor, I found the chest, yes. But more than coins, it holds letters, testimonies, proof of lives saved here. It was not hidden for my gain, nor Mark's, nor Elaine's. It was hidden because my great-grandfather Samuel believed in something bigger, and these letters show it." At a nod from the judge, Margaret stepped forward. Her tall frame seemed taller under the weight of history, her blue eyes sharp behind spectacles. She laid out the letters gently, explaining their authenticity, pointing to Samuel's handwriting, comparing signatures with old records. "These are artifacts," she declared, her voice ringing. "Not family heirlooms in the ordinary sense, but part of our town's story, our nation's memory. To divide them would be to erase them." Then Mrs. Chen rose slowly, leaning on her cane. Her wiry frame trembled, but her voice carried clear. "I was a child," she said softly, "when Samuel gave us bread and a place to sleep. My parents left things with him, letters, small treasures, because they trusted him. We survived because he kept us safe. Now, his descendant has done the same. David has honored that promise." A hush fell, broken only by the faint rustle of papers. Judge Whitaker's eyes softened, and he leaned back, fingers steepled. Finally, Sarah spoke, though she had not been asked. She stood tall, her pale, freckled face steady, her green eyes locking with the judge's. "I've watched David since he returned. He has worked with nothing but his hands and his dog. The town laughed, but he kept going. This mill isn't just his, it's ours, and he has treated it that way." The judge exhaled slowly. His steel-gray eyes lingered on the chest, then on the letters spread across the desk like fragile wings. "I see before me not merely property, but history entrusted to a family and, by extension, to this community. Mr. Miller, your stewardship reflects that trust. The chest and its contents shall remain under your care. They are not to be divided as wealth, but preserved as legacy." His gavel fell with a firm crack. Relief rippled through the room. Sarah's eyes glistened with quiet pride, Henry nodded with satisfaction, and Mrs. Chen wept softly, her cane clutched tight. Margaret smiled faintly, adjusting her spectacles. David sat heavily, his chest swelling, not with triumph, but with humility. Buddy pressed against his leg, tail thumping once. Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun burned golden through the trees, and for the first time, the laughter of doubters seemed far away. The golden light of late autumn draped across the valley, spilling warmth over the old watermill that now stood renewed. Its moss-covered wheel turned steadily again, creaking softly in rhythm with the flowing stream. Fresh timbers had been raised, the roof mended, the yard cleared of weeds. Where once ruin had whispered despair, a new chorus of voices now filled the air. Children's laughter carried across the water, and the chatter of neighbors rose like music against the hum of the wheel. David stood on the wooden porch of the mill, his burly frame dressed in the same faded jeans and beige shirt, though his posture no longer sagged beneath shame. His chestnut hair, streaked with silver, caught the sunlight, and his thin silver-bearded jawline set firm with quiet pride. At his side lay Buddy, the German shepherd, sable coat gleaming, ears relaxed, amber eyes surveying the grounds with calm authority. The dog no longer bristled against mockery. Now he rested like a guardian, satisfied his work was done. The townspeople had gathered for the opening of the Heritage and Hope Center. Margaret Thornton, the tall historian with sharp blue eyes, stood near the entrance arranging displays. Letters once folded in fear and desperation now sat preserved in glass cases. Beside them were small trinkets entrusted to Samuel, lockets, coins, faded photographs. Margaret's usually stern expression softened as she watched children press their noses to the glass. She had fought for the recognition of this site at the county council, her diligence finally rewarded. Sarah was there too, tall and slender, auburn hair braided neatly, her green eyes glowing as she handed out pamphlets. She wore a simple blue dress, her freckled face radiant with satisfaction. Though still marked by grief, she had found new purpose in helping David manage the center. Her gentle nature and quiet strength gave visitors comfort, and when she bent to speak with children, her voice carried warmth, like a teacher's. Henry Dawson, the blacksmith with arms thick as iron, hammered a plaque into place by the gate. His long white beard wagged as he worked, sweat streaking his soot-darkened skin, but his deep brown eyes shone with pride. The plaque bore Samuel's words, "This mill grinds more than wheat, it grinds despair into hope." Henry, once weighed by the loss of his son, now smiled more easily. In helping restore the mill, he had restored something of himself. Mrs. Chen arrived slowly, leaning on her cane, her small frame wrapped in a shawl. Her almond eyes sparkled as she sat on a bench near the stream. She listened as children gathered around, her trembling voice telling them of the night she and her sister had hidden in the loft, the wheels turning, lulling them to sleep. Her wrinkles deepened with each smile, and her story etched itself into the memory of the young. For her, this day was proof that Samuel's kindness had not been forgotten. Even Reverend Collins came, his lean figure framed by a dark coat, his thinning white hair shining in the sunlight. His gray eyes, often tinged with grief for his lost son, now carried a quiet joy. He spoke to the crowd gathered, his voice strong but tender. "This mill is no longer broken wood and stone, it is a beacon. It belongs to us all. Let it remind us that even in times of fear, mercy is stronger." The crowd included new faces too. Clara, the young mother with weary grace, stood with her son Jacob, the freckle-faced boy who had once brought Buddy a bowl of water. Jacob now wore a neat shirt, his hair combed, his eyes bright as he clutched his mother's hand. Clara's brown hair gleamed in the sunlight, her face calm as she watched her son laugh with other children. She had endured hardship quietly, but here she seemed lighter, as if this place had given her hope as well. Throughout the day, children moved in and out of the exhibits, their high voices asking questions. The older townsfolk, once skeptical, sat in shaded corners telling stories of Theodore, of Samuel, of their own struggles. The mill had become more than David's inheritance. It had become the town's memory, a bridge between generations. As the sun sank lower, casting the water in hues of amber, David walked down to the stream. He crouched, dipping his calloused hands into the cool water, watching it ripple away. Buddy padded up beside him, lowering his head to drink. David glanced at his dog, smiling faintly. "We did it, boy," he murmured. Buddy's amber eyes lifted to meet his, steady and full of trust. The dog's tail thumped once against the ground before he settled on the grass, gaze fixed on the glowing mill. David rose, looking back at the building, now alive with lantern light and voices. He felt the weight of his scars, of the years lost to war, but for the first time since his return, they did not crush him. They were part of him, just as the mill's broken beams had once been part of its story. Now both had been restored, not to their old selves, but to something greater. And as twilight settled, David understood with certainty, the mill no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to the people, to their children, to the voices of strangers who had once left letters of gratitude. He had become not the owner, but the keeper of memory. And in that role, he finally found peace. Buddy lay quietly by the water's edge, eyes glinting gold in the fading light. his presence a final reassurance. The mill turned on, steady and eternal, grinding not wheat, but remembrance, hope, and community. From a broken mill, mocked as worthless, to a beacon of memory and hope, David's journey reminds us that no life is beyond repair, and no community too small to rise together. The letters hidden for decades were more than ink on paper. They were seeds of gratitude, proof that even in times of fear, kindness endures longer than stone or gold. With Buddy's loyalty, Sarah's quiet strength, and the community's support, what began as one man's burden became everyone's inheritance, the gift of compassion, resilience, and shared history. And perhaps that is the true miracle, how God uses our scars, our struggles, and even the places we think are ruined to plant new beginnings. Just as the mill ground despair into hope, so can our daily acts of love restore what feels broken. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories of courage, loyalty, and faith. May the Lord bless you and your loved ones with peace, strength, and unshakable hope.